I would like to talk a little bit about Burma because that is the setting of my trilogy, the Heartbeat trilogy, and the third book just came out, The Heart Remembers, which is the third part of a trilogy. If you have missed the first two, you can start with this one. They are all standalone books. I created them the way that you don't necessarily have to read the first one before you read the second one and so on. But of course, nicest is if you were really interested, start with the first one, then the second, then the third. But if you want to skip, you can just read The Heart Remembers. And if it makes you curious, you read the other two. But the question is, I'm being asked a lot, why would a German author write 3 novels set in Burma? And of course, that's a good question. I'm not Burmese. Obviously, I was born in Germany. I lived in America for many, many years. I moved to Asia, became the Asia correspondent for Stern magazine. And I was very, very busy. In those days, it was in 1995. There was a big earthquake in Japan, the Kobe earthquake. And then there was a religious sect, Om Shinriko. They did a gas attack in the Tokyo subway. That was a big story in those days. China was opening up after Tiananmen Square. So I was extremely busy traveling between China, Japan, and Southeast Asia. Nobody cared about Burma in those days. And it is really strange. There was kind of an inner voice, I would call it, like Julia hears in A Well-Tempered Heart, the second book. And the voice told me, go to Burma. I had just been transferred from New York to Hong Kong. As I said, I was very busy. And in those days, if you had told me, okay, go to Burma, but please find it first on the world map, point it out, where is this Burma? I'm not quite sure if I had found it. I had no clue. Maybe I would have mixed it up with Thailand or Laos or Bangladesh. But I had this inner voice, go there. As I said, I can't tell you why. Burma had been closed for decades. There was a coup d'etat in 1962. You couldn't get in for many, many years, and then only for 7 days. And even in 1995, nobody went, no tourists. There were no politicians, there were no entrepreneurs, not even NGOs or the UN. I mean, Burma was out of this world. It was very strict, ruled by a military dictatorship, very brutal, incompetent, corrupt, and nobody went. It was a little bit like North Korea, just with better weather. And I wanted to go. Maybe it was the curiosity of the journalist, and maybe it was something else. My Burmese friends are all deeply convinced that I was a Burmese in a previous life. And that's why I felt so drawn to Burma. I wanted to go home. Anyhow, I don't believe that. I'm not convinced, but there must be a reason why I went. And at that time, I had been a foreign correspondent for many years, and I had the privilege to travel the world. I had been to 70 or 80 different countries. And I came to Burma, and I have to tell you, after a very short time, I knew this is something very, very different. You came in those days, you had to fly over from Bangkok, Bangkok, Yangon, and that's an hour flight time. So this is not that far. And I remember we approached Yangon, which was the capital in those days, and that is a big city. There are probably 8 million people living there. And I remember we approached the airport, a very tiny airport, and we flew over Yangon, and there were no lights. It was like you were flying above a very small town in America. There were a few lights, but not much, not many. And we touched down, the airplane was basically empty. There were between 20 or 30 people in a Boeing 737. And I looked out, there were no other planes. And honestly, the terminal was not much larger than this beautiful bookstore in Denver. So it was really, I was absolutely puzzled. And I had just been in Bangkok, right? And then it took a little while until we got through immigration, and then we were standing in front of this tiny terminal, a little lost, and there were a few young men, and they all wanted us to give us a ride downtown to our hotels. And I got into a car, a very old rundown Toyota, and we slowly drove into town. And again, it looked so different. There were no neon signs, there were no lights, there were no shops, there were lots of people on the streets, no cars, no traffic. And all men were wearing longies, and men were walking, holding hands. Kids were playing soccer on the streets. There were lots of monks walking around, lots of beautiful old houses, all really run down, bad shape. But there was no sign of our, Western culture, Western way of life. And I was so, as I said, irritated that, this is not so far from Bangkok. Where am I? And I asked my driver if there was a McDonald's in town. I wanted to know how far the West had approached. And he kept driving. And then he turned around and said, McDonald's, you said, is the guy maybe Scottish? And I realized he had never heard of McDonald's, the fast food chain. And that was just the beginning. I dropped off my stuff in my hotel and I started walking. It was early evening now, and the streets were full. There were like markets and the tea houses were full, and it was hot and people were just out on the streets. And then a very strange sound I noticed, and then it got dark. All pitch dark. It was a blackout. And it still happens a lot in Burma, but nowadays, if it happens, you just hear a very strange sound like brrr. That's a generator starts. In those days, there were no generators, so it was really dark. But people were used to it, and they lit candles, and they put these candles on sidewalks and door frames and window frames on tables in the tea houses. And after a little while, the whole neighborhood, and I had the feeling the whole city, was all lit by candles. It was a magical atmosphere. And then since there was no traffic and no electricity, the only noises I heard were natural noises. People were laughing, people were chatting, some babies were crying, and kids were yelling. And it was amazing. And then I heard another wonderful sound, and that was a human singing. And I followed it. And sometimes I ended up in a tea house or in a park or on the bank of a river. And it was always the same. There was a young man with a young woman. Sometimes the man was playing the guitar and the man was singing songs. And only later did I learn that that was a very Burmese tradition. A young man falls in love with a young woman, and there was not much to do in those days. So what did they do? They went somewhere, and the guy sings love songs to the girl. That's a Burmese tradition. And I loved it. I thought that's wonderful. I was just very happy it's not a German tradition, because I cannot sing. I would still be single, because even my kids, they don't want me to sing the lullabies because it's so awful. So luckily I'm German, not Burmese. But I realized this is different here. And I spent 3 weeks in Burma, traveled around the country. And of course, after a little while, I noticed this is tough. This country is run by dictators. It's very poor. The average life expectancy is about 50, 52 or 53, maybe. People die early, kids die early, women die, and people don't get so old because there is no medical treatment whatsoever. And there's some malnourishment. So it's a poor country, and it was a country full of fear because the military dictatorship was really brutal. People disappeared, they were tortured. And nevertheless, the people carried this load, this burden with such dignity. They were so friendly and warm and hospitable. I went to poor huts and they were willing to share the last vegetable curry, the last chicken with me. They were incredibly friendly and hospitable. But I went back every year since then, sometimes twice. I think I've been to Burma 30 times, around 30 times. I have very, very good friends there. And what I've described you, these little stories, is similar to what Julia experiences. You know, the main character of these three books is this American lawyer, Julia, born in New York. Her father was Burmese and disappeared shortly after her 27th birthday, I think. And nobody knows where he went. And then Julia's searching for him, and she ends up in Calais, and she meets somebody who tells her the story of her father. That's basically the first book, The Art of Hearing Heartbeats. I don't want to give away too much, but that's kind of, she came to Calais in 95 like me, and she experienced similar things. You know, it was an overwhelming world. It was, every day was a challenge because it's so different. The culture, the thinking, the values. For me, even after 25 years, every trip to Burma is a big challenge because I never know what to expect. I always meet new people and I meet new challenges. I have to question myself, my way of thinking. I give you one example. It was on another trip, probably in 1980, 1999 or something. I did research for Stern because I had heard that the military was using porters. There was a civil war, or there's still civil war going on, basically since independence in 1948. Burma has lots of ethnic minorities. The Burmese are the largest one by far, but there are the Shan and the Karen and the Kachin, and some of them have millions of people. Altogether, I think there are more than 135, and some of these minorities, they want to be independent, so they keep fighting with the military. They have many people under arms. So there has been fighting forever. And in the 1970s, 80s, even 90s, they used a lot of landmines. And the military didn't have enough landmine detectors or landmine sweepers. So what did they do? They used humans. They used young men. They surrounded whole villages, kidnapped all young men, and sent them, you know, took them with them to the jungle, the rice paddies, and sent them ahead as landmine sweepers. They step on a mine, the mine explodes, the guy's dead, but the mine is gone. And of course, nobody does that voluntarily, so that's why they had to kidnap these young men. And not too many survived that, to be honest. But through luck and good connections, I found 3 young men who had survived these terrible months, I think almost a year in the jungle as landmine detectors, sweepers. And they told me their story. And it was a gruesome, awful story. And I got really angry. I realized, you know, they went on and on what they happened and what they had seen and how they were mistreated by the soldiers. And at one point I said, wow, you must hate these soldiers. Oh, they said, no, we deserved that. It was all our fault. What? Why was it your fault that you were kidnapped or what? No, we deserved that. We must have done something terrible in a previous life. That was our karma. And I thought, this is crazy. I can't believe it. I told them they are, you know, they are perpetrators. They have to brought to justice. They have to be put into jail. These criminals, these murderers. I said, no, that was our karma. So that was a moment, for instance, where I really hit a wall. They didn't understand why I was so upset, and I couldn't understand why they put the blame on themselves instead of the people who mistreated them so poorly, so badly. So there are many moments, and even for Julia in all 3 books, I think especially in the 3rd book, The Heart Remembers, she really hits a wall because she sees things are so different, and she would love to adjust, and she would love to be part of it, but sometimes she realizes she can't, or only to a certain extent. And that's, as I said, basically that's what the 3rd book is about. You know, in the 2nd book, Well-Tempered Heart, she has a midlife crisis in New York. It's set 10 years later, 2007. The first one is in 1997, the second one 2007, and she is a successful lawyer in New York, and she starts to hear voices. She is afraid she's going crazy, and she decides to go back to Burma to see her friend and Uba in Calais, and her half-brother. And then she starts to find herself. She calms down and she falls in love with the Burmese. And when the 2nd book ends, she decides, now don't want to give it away, but she's in love with Tata. And I really wanted to know how the story continues. So that's why I had to write the third one, because I wanted to know how the love story with Julia and Tata continues, because they come from such different worlds. Julia, the rich lawyer from New York, and Tata, the poor monk from Burma. And that's one of the themes of the third book. Is their love strong enough to overcome the differences? Can they do it? I won't give it away. So love plays an important part in the third book, like in book 2 and 1. But maybe the third book, The Heart Remembers, is the most complex one, because it deals not just with the love between Julia and Tata, husband and wife, man and woman. No, I think the third one deals with many different phases of love. We have the relationship between Kobobo and Uba, because the story is told from a 12-year-old, that's Kobobo, and he lives with Uba, his uncle, who is almost 80. And they are so close. At the beginning, they have been living together for 7 years. And first, of course, Uba had to take care of Kobobo. Now it changes. Kobobo is 12 and Uba is 80. And now Kobobo takes care of Uba, of course. And they are so close. That's also kind of a love. And again, I was inspired by Burmese tradition. I have a friend, she lived with her grandma. And whenever I visited her, she took care of her grandma with such tenderness and kindness. I remember watching her one day, how she was washing the long gray hair of grandma in the sun. And she did that so nicely. And then grandma had long finger and toenails. And so my friend clipped the finger and the toenails of grandma. And then grandma had a stomach ache and my friend gave her a massage. And that's how it is in Burma with the elderlies, the old people. I mean, there are no retirement homes. And there are no people from other countries you can hire so they take care of your grandfather or your old father, mother. Who does it? The family. And who does it in the family? Mostly the young. So that's what Kobobo does with Uba. He takes care of him now. And that's a love story. And of course, it's a love story between this child, Kobobo, and his parents, Julia and Tata, because they don't live together. And Kobobo doesn't know why. They live in Yangon. Tata, his father, comes once a year to visit him. Mom never shows up. And that is a family secret. And that's what we have in common, no matter whether you're American or Polish or German or Norwegian or Burmese. People do not like to talk about family secrets. So, and Burmese don't ask questions. So Kobobo never asks Uba what's wrong or why don't I live with my parents. It is as it is, and he accepts it. But still, he misses his parents. And then one day he wakes up one night. Usually Uba sleeps next to him, and Uba is gone. He gets up, he is afraid, but then he hears a very strange sound from the living room of the hut, and he gets up and he sees through a curtain Uba sitting next to a candle in front of a typewriter, and he is writing something. Kobobo was very curious, but he goes back to bed. Next morning he wakes up. Now Uba is sound asleep, but Kobobo is curious. He really wants to know what is Uba writing at night. And it's not for him, of course, otherwise it's a secret, otherwise he wouldn't do it at night. So he gets up, he searches the whole hut, and eventually he finds the typewriter and the notes, and he's torn. He knows he's not supposed to do it. On the other hand, he is so curious, he starts to read. And usually I don't read at my readings, you should read my books yourself. But here I would like to read just 10 lines because they lead right into the story. That's the first lines of what Kobobo reads. They demanded a courage of themselves beyond the strength of their hearts. By the time they realized their mistake, it was already too late. She had no plan but a dream. He had neither one nor the other. He was afraid. And of course, fear is the natural enemy of love. A person who loves has no fear. A person who fears cannot love, only cling. Both were prisoners in their own worlds who believed they could free one another if they only loved sufficiently. Love can accomplish many miracles, but it could not fulfill this hope, a hope as old as love itself.